Yá'át'ééh, Bene. Good morning, my relatives. This is Mark Charles. Today is Friday, August 9th, and I'm grateful that you're here with me. I have been traveling this week, and so that's why I haven't done a second cup of coffee yet this week. But I got back yesterday, and so I'm very grateful to be home again, and I'm looking forward to having a discussion with you as I have a sip of my second cup of coffee. So I invite you to grab your favorite morning beverage and sit down and let's have a conversation. So I want to begin like I always do, which is acknowledging I'm speaking to you from Piscataway lands. These are now called Washington, D.C., but the Piscataway are the indigenous hosts of these lands. I want to thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands. I want to just remind myself and others that we need to walk humbly on these lands, as the history of these lands extends far beyond the moment when Columbus got lost at sea. So, my Piscataway relatives, thank you for your stewardship of these lands. This last week I was up in rural Pennsylvania, kind of western Pennsylvania, near about an hour and a half outside of Pittsburgh. I was at a camp, a Mennonite camp, at a retreat with some worship leaders, and I posted this picture on my social media earlier this week, and I got a lot of feedback and comments. It's a pretty diverse group of worship leaders. There are actually several people who couldn't be there. But there's maybe 3 or 4 more people who weren't able to attend. But we're working on a guide for a global hymn book. And basically, we're trying to bring in voices from different regions, different ethnic groups, and different voices around the world to train worship leaders, advise worship leaders on how to best and most respectfully sing and lead these songs that come from a global community. And so I am talking to worship leaders who want to lead with indigenous songs. And it was actually a really good weekend, a really good week. We were there Monday through Wednesday. I came home Thursday morning. And I took the time over the week because it was a writing retreat. So I brought my computer. But as you know, or if maybe you haven't heard, I'm working really hard to sit less and move more. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is to teach myself how to write via dictation. Talking into my phone, I use Dragon as my dictating software, and I talk into my phone, and it dictates it into a document, and then I can edit that document. But it takes a bit of training, to think and talk while you're walking or while you're outdoors or while you're just moving around, but B, to write with your voice instead of with your mind. And from the research I've read, the stories I've read of people who've done this, who've made the transition from writing on a computer to writing via dictation, once you get it down, you can write a lot faster, especially the first draft of your writing. It's much harder to edit. You have to sit down at a computer to do that. But as far as getting your first draft out, you can get that out much quicker via dictation than via writing. And so every morning we would have breakfast together, and then we would maybe take a few minutes to talk about what we're working on and what we're planning to do writing that day. And then everyone else would go off to different places to sit down at a desk or to have conference calls or to sit down at the computer and do writing. And I would literally go walking. I would walk the trails and the paths around the retreat center, and I would take my phone with me, and I would spend some time reflecting on what I want to write about, and then I just started dictating different drafts of what I was working on. I even wore my barefoot shoes and walked through some of the rivers, or not through the rivers, but on the rocks by the rivers. And yeah, it was really fun. So, normally, and just as a comparison, one of my colleagues who was there, she is working really hard to move a lot too, and to stay fit and exercise and tracking her steps. And at dinner one day, we were just comparing our step counts, and I think I was up at 15,000, and she was at about 3,000. And so, again, this is the difference between sitting and writing all day and walking around and trying to dictate. And so I found it. I found it worked really well in my training. I'm not quite there yet. I don't think I'm quite as productive dictating as I am typing on a computer, but I definitely grew a lot in my comfortability this past week. And so that was really a great chance to be out in nature and to still get I was still walking. On average, I walk 15 to 20,000 steps a day. And I was able to keep up that rate while I was there. And so, yeah, it felt really good. And plus, I got to go out and see some really beautiful scenery and just got to walk through and look at some different parts of the landscape out there. And it really was a beautiful place. So, yeah, it was very, very, very nice. Anyway, that book, I don't know when it's going to be published. Our goal is to have the writing done by the end of this year. But I don't know when the book will be published. But I'll definitely let you know as it gets ready to come out. So while I was there, while I was up in this rural part of Pennsylvania, I still had cell phone service. They still had Wi-Fi, so I could still keep in touch with the world and what was going on, even as I was out walking. And of course, I was following the nomination of Tim Walz as the VP nominee for Kamala Harris's campaign. And I was actually really pleased. I know that, in fact, we had several conversations over dinner while we were at this retreat where people just asked me, because they knew I had run for president. They knew I was pretty engaged in politics. And they asked me my opinion of what I thought about Tim Walz and what I thought about the Harris-Walz ticket. And I read about him. I was aware of Tim Walz before he kind of stepped into the national spotlight, primarily because his lieutenant governor is someone I know, Peggy Flanagan, who is Native and is doing a great job as the lieutenant governor in Minnesota. And so I was aware of Tim Walz before he kind of stepped into the more national stage and national spotlight. And I'm thrilled, right? If he wins and if they win and become vice president, then that means Peggy will literally become the first female Native governor in the history of this country, which would be fantastic. Anyway, so I liked Tim Walz. I didn't know a lot about his policies and his stances, but what I had heard about him prior to this past week, I liked him. And one of the things I liked best about, one of the things, I've said this before on my second cup of coffee, is one of the things I'm looking for in the Harris campaign and Vice President Harris's campaign is how willing is she to step out from under the Joe Biden umbrella and really establish her own voice. And one of the governors that she was thinking of appointing or nominating as VP was the governor of Pennsylvania, who was a much more conservative, kind of middle of the road candidate, very supportive of Israel and the conflict that's going on in Gaza. And that would be, I really envisioned, if she picked him, that would be kind of maintaining this status quo mentality that the Biden administration really has towards not just Gaza, but towards governing in general. Because if you watch Joe Biden during his campaign, right, he campaigned during the primary to his base, but then during the general election, both in 2020 and in 2024, he was really courting mainstream, middle of the road, moderate Democrats, and even a lot of moderate Republicans, right? He was really recording a lot of moderate Republicans, which again isn't bad, but it meant he was not willing to go out to kind of really step out and do some things that would be seen as outside the mainstream. And so I thought I was really impressed with Vice President Harris in that she named Tim Walz as her VP. And that I saw that as her willingness to kind of step out from behind the shadow of Joe Biden and really begin to establish some of her own voice. And so I like that. And one of the things I liked about the Harris campaign, and this was even before she chose Tim Walz as her running mate, was I liked the way they were referring to Donald Trump and JD Vance, particularly as weird. I liked that shift because Democrats are really a party of fear. And they do this very effectively, I've said this before, you've heard me say this before, right? Republicans know their policies are not very popular. They know they're not growing their party very much. And so they work very hard to keep people from voting, to prevent people from registering to vote. The less people who vote, the better chance Republicans have of winning an election. Democrats in general, right? They campaign, they have a much more diverse base, and they have very wide open and broad primaries, but, well, not this year. But then they usually, 99% of the time, nominate the most status quo, middle of the road, white landowning male from the upper echelons of the 1% that they can find. And then their nominee doesn't reflect the values or even the faces of their base. And so then they work very hard during the general election to keep third party and independent candidates from getting onto the ballot. So Republicans dislike voters and Democrats dislike competition. And I heard this well before I ran. I knew that was one of the Democrats' strategies and how they dealt with competition from outside their party. But I felt it very, very intensely when I was running, where many people, friends of mine, right, people who support my work and liked what I was doing prior to my campaign, when I was running in 2020, many of those people came to me and said, Mark, I can't vote for you. Donald Trump is just way too scary, and voting for you is like voting for Trump, and I cannot support you. And that's what Democrats do, right? The libertarians steal far more votes from the right than the Green Party steals from the left. They raise more money, the libertarians do. They steal more votes than the Green Party does. But the Republicans aren't nearly as afraid of the libertarians as the Democrats are afraid of the Green Party. And they work very hard to terrify their voters about their opponent, whether it's George Bush or whether it's Donald Trump, and to turn them into, I'm going to call it a boogeyman, right? This kind of mythical, scary figure that you can't really define and can take on the face of almost anything. And they really work hard to turn their opponent into the boogeyman. And then they tell their voters, if you don't vote for our candidate, for the Democratic candidate, then you're voting for the boogeyman. And they make them larger than life and more fearful than they really are. And they really center them and try to just drive a wedge of fear into their voters, into their supporters. And what I liked about what the Harris campaign was starting to do was they were beginning to refer to Donald Trump and JD Vance, not as the boogeyman, but as weird. And to me, I really like that because, right, especially Trump represents all of the classic symptoms of narcissism, right? He needs to be the center of attention. And by making him a larger than life, fearful boogeyman, it just feeds what looks to be his narcissistic tendencies, right? Where it still centers him. It still puts the attention on him. He either wants to be everyone's hero or everyone's bad guy, but he wants to be something to everybody. And so Democrats, and Joe Biden especially, was turning Donald Trump into this massively ominous and fearful presence that was at the center of everything they were doing. And so I liked it when the Harris campaign began to more dismissively refer to Donald Trump and JD Vance, not as the boogeyman, but as just weird, right? They're doing some weird things. And so when I heard after Tim Walz was named the VP nominee and was joining the ticket with Vice President Harris, and I learned that language actually came from him, I loved it. I thought that is a great way the more I read about it, I'm going to share a few articles with you. This is one of the original interviews. It was earlier in July, well before he was named the vice presidential, or before he was named the vice presidential nominee. And I'm just going to put this into the chat right now. This is an interview he did on MSNBC. And I encourage you to listen to the interview. I'm not usually a big fan of MSNBC. They're pretty much a partisan bullhorn for the Democrats. But I did listen to this interview, and I liked it. I liked what Tim Walz said. I liked the way he articulated himself and the way that he even framed how he had to govern and be in politics in a state like the Midwest, where you have a very large cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul, and very small rural communities, including a lot of native reservations. And so I encourage you to listen to that interview and just listen to the way he talks about how he tries to build coalition and tries to build some more consensus among all his constituents in that state. And I really like the way he did it. And I like the way that he dismissed Donald Trump, not as the boogeyman, but it's just weird, right? He's just doing some weird things that doesn't even make sense to the people he's trying to woo. And then, of course, right, so then you have the New York Times had to get into the action, and so they started writing stuff about the use of the word weird, and they have to court their audience, and so they started talking about it. And then there's another article here in AP News that talks about the use of the word weird and how that became kind of accepted or even liked by younger Gen Z voters and younger voters within the Democratic Party. So yeah, those are all interesting articles. Then I also want to share with you this article in Politico, because again, like me, and I knew some things about Tim Walz, but I didn't know a lot about him. And so I started reading more about who he was and what his background was. And of course, we all heard that he's a former school teacher and he was a football coach and so on and so forth. And I found this article on Politico. It's 55 things to know about Tim Walz, Kamala Harris's VP or pick for VP. And I want to just highlight a few of the things that this article pointed out. Number 10, right, was he taught on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. He taught on Pine Ridge in South Dakota. And he was a teacher on one of the reservation schools in Pine Ridge. And I, as someone who's lived on the Navajo Nation and lived on reservations, I respect him for being willing to go and to teach on the Pine Ridge Reservation. If you want to hear a little more about that, when he ran for governor in 2018 and 2019, this was a story about him back then when he ran, and this mentions that he taught on Pine Ridge. So you can just kind of a bio about him when he ran back in 2018, 2019, when he was first running for governor. And so that's one of the interesting things about him. 27 on the list was more because he was in the state government before he ran for governor. And number 27 on the list was more than half of the bills he co-sponsored between 2015 and 2017 were introduced by non-Democrats. And so again, he has some history of working across and outside of party lines. 35 on the list. Again, in recent weeks, Walz is credited for popularizing the Democratic Party's latest line of attacks against the Republican ticket when he called Trump and Vance these really weird people. And so again, he was the one who kind of brought that into the Democratic vernacular. Number 37, and this made me even more happy. He told the New York Times that his comments about weirdness are about Trump and Vance, not Republicans generally. And weird is specific to them. I'm certainly not talking about Republicans. I'm not talking about the people who are at these rallies. I'm hearing this from my Republican friends because the people at those rallies, they're the ones who can most benefit from the message we're delivering. And so I really liked, right? And that's where Hillary Clinton went off when she talked about the deplorable people who were following Donald Trump, and she was demonizing the whole party. And again, Walz is more talking specifically about Trump, and what he's doing is just weird. 39, Walz first met his lieutenant governor, Peggy Flanagan, when he attended Wellstone Action, founded after the 2002 death of Senator Paul Wellstone to train progressive leaders, activists, and candidates. I showed up in a fantastic young trainer who turned out to be Peggy Flanagan. And that's when we started our friendship. So again, he's known Peggy for a while. 43, again, this is just off of my health stuff and the running I've been doing recently. Walz is a runner who has participated in multiple competitions in Minnesota, Twin Cities. I found that even before the most stressful events, if I've gone for a run, I'm calmer and more collected. I also like number 48. It says Walz signed a bill last May expanding voting rights for an estimated 55,000 formerly incarcerated residents. I have to applaud that. And then 55, Walz is a self-described optimist. And it says he likes to plan for the worst, but he views himself and sees himself as an optimist. And I think that's really important in politics, to keep a view of optimism. So all of this to say, I am very pleased that Vice President Harris named Tim Walz as her running mate. I'm pleased he's on the ticket. I'm grateful that she's willing to kind of establish her own persona and step out from behind Joe Biden's shadow. And I really like the way that she's even allowed him to influence her campaign. And instead of treating Trump and Vance as the boogeyman, making them larger than life, that she's able to be more dismissive of them. And again, this is one of the things that I think personally is driving Trump crazy, because he needs to be the center of attention. And so by dismissing him instead of making him larger than life, it's actually a much better approach, a way to kind of to disarm his most effective tactics. And so, yeah, I'm really grateful not only that Tim Walz was brought onto the ticket, but that he's able to influence the way the ticket presents itself to the public. So I'm continuing to watch. I'm continuing to pay attention. I'm grateful that it looks like there's going to be at least one debate, and maybe even two or three. I really want to see a debate, at least one debate, if not all three. I think there's a proposal for three that Trump has at least proposed. And I know that Vice President Harris has agreed to at least one of them so far. And I'm also really looking forward to seeing a debate between Walz and Vance. I think that will be really interesting. And another thing I like about Walz, and I'll put this article out there. This is the ABC News. It's an ABC News article, and it's comparing Vance and Walz. In this article, one of the things it points out when it talks about Walz's finances, it says in 2019, Walz reported a pension account worth as much as $100,000, as well as a life insurance plan with a value as high as $50,000, according to a financial disclosure that year. Walz does not invest in any stocks, bonds, or other securities, according to U.S. House disclosure in 2019. As of January, Walz continued to forgo ownership of any securities, a Minnesota Financial Forum shows. He does not invest in real estate either. Walz and his wife Gwen appear to have sold their home in Mankato after gaining access to the governor's mansion. And so as someone who's looked into, I've been doing a lot of research on stocks and investments this past year. I've talked some about that, but to have, of course, when you're setting policy, the temptation or the opportunity to line your pockets financially is great, or even to benefit from the policies. And so to have a governor who probably has the means to invest not be investing in stocks, I respect that. Also because, again, there's a lot of other challenges with the stock market. I won't go into all of that right now, but I respect Tim Walz but he is a public servant. He's a governor. He's been in politics, and he does not invest in stocks. And I applaud that. I like that about him. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Let's see who's on with me. George, Yá'át'ééh, thanks for joining me today. Glad you could be here. Hal, Yá'át'ééh, thanks for being here. Susan, Yá'át'ééh, good morning. Thanks for being here. It's great to have everyone on. Brian, Yá'át'ééh Bennett, thanks for joining me from Tennessee. Chad, thanks for joining me in Baltimore. It's great to have you here. I appreciate all of you for being on this morning. I wanted to share one other thing with you, and I'm just going to put this into the chat. If you follow my social media, we shared this past week, and my assistant and I, we kind of post some of the social media together, especially when I'm traveling. Well, she actually works to keep my social media on consistently. I share more of the personal posts and pictures, and she shares a lot of the updates about my schedule and things that are coming up. But we posted this past week a blog post I wrote back in 2008. It was just a few years after we moved from the hogan we lived in on the Navajo Nation to a smaller house in the community of Fort Defiance. And it's one of the early blog posts that I wrote when I was just starting to blog and just starting to kind of find my public voice. And the article is titled, "When I Grow Up, I Want to Be a Shepherd." And I talked about living a much more traditional life in the hogan, but also supporting my family by working remotely via online remote work and the internet, being able to still work as a consultant via the internet, even at the hogan where we lived, and while at the same time learning how to herd sheep and live in this traditional way. And I wrote this article titled, "When I Grow Up, I Want to Be a Shepherd." And I'm going to put it into the chat now. It was on my social media earlier this week. But if you want to just read some of my early thoughts when I was just beginning to kind of find my public voice and use my public voice, this is one of the early blog posts that I wrote back in 2008, 2007. I forget what exact year it was, but it was fairly early on in my public work. Anyway, so that's out there if you'd like to read that. I also want to let you know, if you like what I'm doing and if you like the dialogues I'm trying to have and the perspectives I'm trying to share, I work very hard to keep my voice independent. And one of the ways I do that is I don't monetize my social media, and that I don't benefit from the advertising that YouTube puts on my channel or that other places put on my posts. I could monetize those, but I don't want to give advertisers any influence over what I do and do not write. And so I don't monetize my YouTube channel. I don't monetize my social media that way. But I do have a Patreon site, which is a subscription site where I make posts on a regular basis and I take the conversation deeper. I go in one of my tiers there is called the Decolonizing Faith tier, where once a month I talk more in depth about the book that I'm writing. I have another tier called Join the Conversation, where I talk more in depth about the work that I'm doing and just things I'm talking about in other parts of my work. One of the more popular tiers is the Ask Questions tier, where once a month I have at least one Q&A where I answer questions about what I've said over the past month or things I've written in my book or other stuff like that. And so it's a great way to go deeper in the conversation with me, as well as to support the work that I'm doing and help keep my voice as independent as possible. The other way that you can do that is to buy copies of my book. I am a co-author of the book Unsettling, The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. And one of the things that I do is, if you buy 10 signed copies of my book from my website, I will give your group, your book study, a virtual 45-minute Q&A at some point over the next year that you can schedule with me at your convenience, and we'll find the best time to work that out. And it's a great way to kind of take the conversation deeper and have some more specific questions. And I love those Q&As. I do maybe one every 2 or 3 weeks, and I really look forward to those because it lets me have a conversation with a group of people who've read the book, they've thought about it, and they're really pondering some of these things deeply. And every conversation is different. And so it's a great way to kind of take the conversation deeper and to expose a group of people to the doctrine of discovery and the book I co-authored, Unsettling Truths. Anyway, my relatives, I'm grateful for you. I'm sorry I was away this week and only got to do 1 second cup of coffee with you, but I'm really enjoyed having this conversation this morning. I hope you find the things I share helpful and insightful, and I'm definitely intrigued to follow the campaign for the next 90 some days up until November. But yeah, I hope your morning beverage is as good as mine is. Walk in beauty, my relatives. And may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. Hook on that.